Can the redemptive reading of a work be resisted? Can we approach cultural objects that are indelibly associated with historical events, stand back, examine and rethink the way in which they have been presented? Can we read works with care and respect, fostered by an intimate knowledge of what has preceded to an understanding of how it may function in our own time? How can we present a work in an ethical manner when the work has gained fame and notoriety through its performances in a place designed to be the front for murder and genocide? How do we represent, and by extension represent, a work that gave a sense of relief and escape in such a place, according to the testimony of those who witnessed it? These ethical questions have been at the forefront of my consciousness for the past 17 years, from the time I first met Jerry Rind, a Czech survivor of the Terezín concentration camp ghetto, to the present moment and beyond. These ethical questions framed the Sydney Brundibar project from its very beginning. Today's presentation will interrogate the ethical, historic, ethnographic and practical factors that shaped the Sydney Brundibar project. But before I begin with an account of the project itself, I will define my understanding of the concept of the redemptive reading. In the late 1960s, at a conference in Yad Vashem, a survivor historian, Meir Dvorzhevsky, in response to the many years of categorizing Holocaust survivors or victims as going like lambs to the slaughter, postulated the concept of unarmed resistance in the Holocaust. He used the Hebrew term amidah, literally meaning stand, to describe this phenomenon. Yehuda Bauer's monumental 2001 work, Rethinking the Holocaust, devotes an entire chapter to the notion. His definition is on the screen. Thousands of performances have been devoted to presenting cultural material that fits into or comments on the idea of spiritual cultural resistance. But, as with most powerful and enduring discourses, a salient critique was bound to emerge, and it did so in the 2005 work of Shirley Gilbert, Music in the Holocaust, Confronting Life in the Nazi Ghettos and Camps. Gilbert categorises the reading of spiritual or cultural resistance in the Holocaust as a redemptive discourse. That's a definition on the board. A phenomenon directly related to the 19th century teleological construct of music as the language of transcendent emotion and expression. The consequence of attributing heroic resistance to musical activities, in Shirley Gilbert's words, quote, mythicizes and decontextualizes the phenomenon, choosing instead to espouse cliches and comforting stories, end quote. Gilbert argues for the readmission of the complex gamut of musical experience in camps and ghettos. My own work with musical testimony of survivors confirms the diversity of musical experiences, ranging far beyond the rubric of resistance to include distraction, entertainment, smut, even psychological ways of processing immediate traumatic experiences. Brundibar has been read as a work of spiritual resistance ever since its revival, and resisting this redemptive discourse is not easy. Nowhere is the redemptive discourse better exemplified in the following clip, a brief excerpt from a special broadcast called They Shall Be Heard Again. CBS News produced the program in 1971, around the time of the Jewish High Holidays, narrated by one of the greatest actor-directors of the Polish Yiddish stage to survive the Holocaust, Ida Kaminska. 3 years prior to this, she and her theatre company were driven out of Poland in an anti-Semitic purge of the remaining Jews there, who were obviously Jewish. As far as I know, the television screening is, in this excerpt is the very first public iteration of Brundibar since its final performance in 1944. The performers are the children from the Julius Hart School of Music in Hartford, Connecticut. They sing in Czech because the English translation had not yet been realised. The musical consultant for this program was Joža Karas, who rediscovered many of the Terezín compositions, including Brundibar. For the redemptive discourse, please pay particular attention to the words of the narrative, which begins with a translation of the final victory song from the opera. And I've also transposed the words onto the screen in case you can't understand her accent.
We have won. We did not give in. We are not afraid. Strong words of children shouted, and the rallying cry was not a call to arms, but a message of faith and strength. Strength for the weak, the hopeless, and the beaten. Out of the music of Terezín came their strength. They fought hard to keep their minds alive, while the Nazis devised the means to break their bodies. The strength in their souls lives on. That strength is the strength of Jews.
Kaminska articulates the redemptive discourse better than I could ever do. It is a discourse that limits how and what we can say about this material, even as it is as powerful as she delivers it. But so to the matter at hand, Brundibar. Brundibar is a small opera written for children to perform. Approximately 35 minutes long, Hans Krasser composed it in 1938 with lyrics by Adolf Hofmeister as an entry for a children's opera competition organised by the Czechoslovak Ministry of Education. Brundibar received its premiere in 1941 in occupied Prague, performed by the boys of the Jewish Children's Orphanage, accompanied by piano, violin and percussion. Additional performances took place prior to the commencement of deportation of Jews of the Bohemian and Moravian Protectorate in November 1941. The first transports went to ghettos in occupied Poland until the fortress town of Terezín, known in German as Theresienstadt, was ready for occupation. Terezín lies among the meadows and gardens at the confluence of the rivers Orge and Labe. After the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia, it was designated a concentration camp for the 75,000 Jews of Bohemia and Moravia, but functioned more akin to a Nazi-run ghetto. In November 1941, the first detail arrived to prepare the site for mass occupation. Following this, the transports began. Some stayed only momentarily in Terezín before being sent to the east. By mid-1942, the east meant deportation to the extermination camps of Treblinka and Auschwitz. Along with the Czech Jews, 55,000 Jews from Germany and Austria were sent to Terezín, many hoaxed into selling their worldly possessions to the Nazi government in exchange for fictitious property at an alleged spa town called Theresienstadt. Most were elderly, loyal Germans, decorated war veterans, prominent community members, scholars and famous artists. In time, Danish, Dutch, Hungarian, Slovakian and Polish Jews joined the population. At the height of occupation and overcrowding in summer 1942, almost 55,000 malnourished people were living in horrific conditions in a space designed for 7,000. As with other Nazi-administered ghettos, a puppet Jewish Ältestenrat, a council of elders, was entrusted with day-to-day management, including the awful task of compiling lists for deportation to the east. From early December 1941, secret musical evenings were held in Terezín, first in separated barracks and later in mixed company. By mid-1942, the amount of talented artists prompted the Ältestenrat to apply to the SS for permission to establish an administrative organisation for cultural work. This Freizeitgestaltung, or leisure time association, became responsible for the vast range of theatrical, educational, library, musical and even sporting activities for the inmates. Opera, oratorio, chamber music, symphonic and choral organisations, cabaret and theatre troupes sprung up eager to distract themselves and audiences from day-to-day deprivations. On the 7th of July 1943, the piano score of Brundibar was smuggled into the Terezín Ghetto, where the composer reorchestrated the work for a larger ensemble based on forces available at that time. And the premiere of the Terezín version took place on the 23rd of September 1943 in the attic of the Magdeburg barracks. Realising the propagandistic potential of this and other artistic endeavours that were taking place, the SS arranged a special new staging of Brundibar in June 1944 in a fully functioning Sokolovna theatre, which had been, up to this point, totally out of bounds for Jews of Terezín. New sets were designed and painted based on the Prague sketches, and a live performance was arranged for delegates of the Red Cross from Switzerland, Denmark and Germany who were inspecting the ghetto. In order to prepare for this visit, a Verschönerungsaktion, a beautification project, was begun in January 1944, beginning with mass transports to Auschwitz to relieve overcrowding, then a large refurbishment project in the style of a Potemkin village, with false shops, false children's playground, false cafe and bandstand, etc. The Red Cross were duly deceived. The ruse worked so well that a film was commissioned, directed by the famous Weimar actor Kurt Geron. By the end of August, filming was completed, the ruse was over, a fresh set of transports cleared most of the ghetto, and cultural activities came to a virtual standstill, including the performances of Brundibar, which was, at the end, the most popular theatrical production in the ghetto. Within the span of 4 years, 33,500 people had died in Terezín of disease, exhaustion and starvation. 88,000 had been deported east, with fewer than 3,000 Czech Jews returning. Of the 23,000 that were liberated in the ghetto on the 8th of May 1945, less than half had been there longer than 5 months. The plot of Brundibar is as follows. Aninka and Pepíček, 2 little children, have a sick mother. The doctor has prescribed milk for her health, and they go seeking milk in the town marketplace, but they have no money to purchase it. 3 traders hawk their wares, an ice cream man, a baker and a milkman. The children engage the milkman in a song, but he tells them that they need money for milk. Suddenly, the children spot an organ grinder, Brundibar, playing on the street corner. Seeing his success, they decide to busk as well, and proceed to sing a song about geese, much to the annoyance of the townsfolk and Brundibar, who chases them away. 3 magical talking animals, a cat, a sparrow and a dog, come to their help, and together they plan to recruit the other children of the neighbourhood. Night falls with an orchestral interlude. The dawn comes. The children and the animals begin morning exercises, and the townsfolk get ready for the day. The plan goes ahead, and the animals and the children drown out Brundibar every time he starts up busking, and then they all join together in a lullaby. The townsfolk are very moved by the beauty of the song and give Aninka and Pepíček money. Suddenly, Brundibar sneaks in and steals their takings. All the children and animal give chase, and they recover the money. The opera concludes with the cast singing a victory march about cooperation, friendship, and defeating the evil organ grinder. The Sydney Brundibar project was a collaborative production between myself, Opera Prometheus, and the Sydney Jewish Museum. Many survivor friends from the Czech Jewish community in Sydney had been gently pressuring me to stage the opera from as early as 2004. Although it had its Australian premiere in Canberra in 2000 and 2 other seasons in Adelaide in 2003 and Melbourne in 2004, it had not been performed in Sydney despite the large number of Czech, Austrian and German survivors living here. I attempted to spark interest in the opera from 2009, however there were no tangible partners. Festivals and local arts companies were simply not interested, overstretched or too busy to stage the work. 2 circumstances led to the successful Sydney Brundibar project. an introduction in 2011 by Professor Konrad Kwiat, former Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Sydney University, to members of the Jewish community who were interested in supporting the venture, and a meeting in early 2012 with Shana Galvin, Sarah Penichka-Smith and Melanie Penichka-Smith, directors of this new opera company, Opera Prometheus, dedicated to presenting affordable, accessible opera and giving work to young performers. The Sydney Brundibar website, created by Mollison Communications, gave public and potential participants in the opera a rigorous and research background of the work, including an endorsement from our patron Richard Gill, who had been musical director for the Melbourne and Adelaide shows, and who continues work as a passionate advocate of music education in the schools. Children were recruited via the City Children's Choir and a comprehensive mail-out to public and private primary schools around Sydney. The children's cast was a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish participants, with some coming from Holocaust survivor backgrounds. We limited the age of our performers to 12 years at the time of audition. One of our cast members turned 13 during the production. From the very starting point, Opera Prometheus directors deferred to my intimate knowledge of the work, history of its Terezín performances and its revival, just as I deferred to their experience with producing and directing stage and opera productions. All significant directorial decisions were achieved through consensus, cooperation and collaboration, informed by the discussions I had conducted with 27 Terezín survivors for my doctoral dissertation. I began talking to Terezín survivors formally in 2002, and my interview subjects ranged from the two surviving principal performers from the Terezín production of Brundibar, Ella Steinova-Weisberger, who played the cat, and Greta Hofmeisterova-Klingsberg, who played Aninka, to famous pianists who had seen the production, such as Edith Steiner-Krauss and Anneliese Hertzsommer, whose son Raffi was the bird in the original production. I interviewed chorus members and understudies, members of the audience, and even those who had not seen the production but had heard about it in the ghetto. But perhaps the most important of all of my subjects was Jaroslav Jerry Rind, whose dedication to the opera remains as fervent today as it was when I met him in 1998. Here's a short clip around the same time as the production of Jerry. I need to go back to 1998, to that encounter with Jerry Rind, when he raised the subject of Brundibar with me.
In 1943, I had no idea what Brundibar is, the story, the opera. But I was working as a carpenter, and a big chap came to me and he said, "Would you do us a favor? We need some timber brought." I didn't ask what it's for. He didn't say what it's for, but they made the fence for Brundibar out of it.
Jerry has played an integral role in all Australian productions of Brundibar, speaking to every cast, advising directors and talking to audiences. I introduced Jerry to Sarah Penichka-Smith, who spent some time with him. They share a common Czech heritage and love of Czech culture. Shana Galvin, the director, took Jerry's testimony about the original set, stayed faithful to his concept, but extended it so that the three parts of the fence could transform into different spaces to indicate different scenes, such as the home, the town square, nighttime, etc. We had an opportunity to pay homage to the work of another survivor in this process, the artwork of Kitty Pasarova-Levy. Kitty had attended the classes of Friedel-Dicker Brandeis, a teacher in textile design and printmaking at the Bauhaus, who was deported to Terezín in December 1942. In preparation for her deportation, among the 50 kilos of allotted luggage, she packed paint, paper, and brushes and books for children's art projects. At the end of her time in Terezín, prior to deportation and eventual murder in Auschwitz, she had gathered 4,500 drawings and artworks from the Terezín children, and they were all saved. Kitty's work, Collage of Vase with Flowers, is the only work that we know of by a Terezín survivor who lives in Australia, and it formed the centrepiece of the reverse set.
And then at the end, when Brundibar is defeated, we turn the fences, and on the back of them we have paintings, and one of them is based on a work by a Terezín survivor. The others are sort of a riff on the sorts of artwork that was being done in Terezín by the children.
You can see there that's the original artwork by Kitty. Both the children's cast and the young adults cast were able to interact directly with survivors. 2 Terezín survivors came in to talk with the children during the production, Joe Neustadtl and Edith Sheldon. Although Joe was not in the Terezín production, he sang in children's choirs in the ghetto and can be clearly identified in the propaganda film, clapping enthusiastically after the final curtain of Brundibar. Edith Sheldon was a teenager in the ghetto and worked in the Landwirtschaft, a forced labour contingent. Her story is one where musical association literally saved her life and the life of her mother. Ida Drucker was a busy piano teacher in Prague. When she and daughter Edith arrived in the Schleuse, the sorting area before entry into the ghetto, one of her former pupils working in the Schleuse recognised her and nominated them as his aunt and cousin, thereby affording them protekcia, which one might loosely translate as sponsorship. In reality, this guaranteed jobs for them in critical industries and protection from the deportation to the east. For our production, Edith volunteered to speak to the children about her experiences, and she also coached them in Czech pronunciation for the lullaby, the song that wins the hearts of the townsfolk. I chose to keep the lullaby in the original language for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it loses meaning and charm in translation. Second, I felt it important to represent the Czech content in Brundibar in at least one of the songs. And finally, Ella Weisberger, the cat in the Terezín production, mentioned to me that the Washington DC production of Brundibar sang that song in Czech in deference to the original cast. The audience could access Edith's translations of the lullaby in the concert program. Here's a short clip of Edith's interaction with the cast.
Were most of the cast taken to Auschwitz?
Yes, there were a lot of people who were taken to Auschwitz. And that's why it's got so much meaning, particularly for survivors, because it makes them remember those kids. For me, this project, more than anything else, is about performing this for the survivors. That's my main mission in bringing this to life. She's going to give you a word-for-word translation of what you're singing, so you know exactly what the words are, so it makes it more meaningful for you, okay?
Maminka kolíbá vychladlou kolébkou, myslí si, co bude, až bude babičkou. The mother rocks the cradle that had gone cold, and she thinks what will be when she becomes grandmother.
1, 2. One of the reasons was to help the children contextualise the opera in the context of Terezín. The second one, more importantly, was for them to actually interact with survivors in a meaningful way.
What was it like in the camp?
We were very squashed together, and we were 17 girls in a little room. We were always hungry. And when I was guiding in the Jewish Museum, I used to tell the kids, when you're hungry, you know, when you get home, you'll get something to eat. We were hungry, we knew we were hungry today, we'll be hungry tomorrow, and we'll be hungry the next week. It's very important that it's being produced, yes, because it was such an important piece of music.
He's a great Brundibar, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Brundibar was a pedagogical experience for cast and crew. As you will see in the upcoming clip, members of the young adult cast played an active part in mentoring principal performers in the children's cast.
The upside is that there's an awful lot of energy in the room and some really good ideas get churned out by the kids.
I think Brundibar is just a bit misunderstood. He's been brought up badly.
Gather round the ice cream seller, neath his icy blue umbrella. Good, let's do it. Children weren't allowed to be educated in Terezín in a formal sense.
I think we can maybe do it a little bit. Just for that one line there. And
they had to be educated in secret.
Everybody step and sway now to the tune my organs play. My way is the...
And often the secret education programs were concealed by artistic endeavours, rehearsals or cultural endeavours. Brundibar taught kids movement. It taught them how to remember music. It gave them a musical experience that was quite sophisticated. And music, of course, helps you with all sorts of other things in life. A good example of our pedagogical practice was the inclusion of dance in the production. Camilla Rosenbaum, a modern dance exponent from Prague, choreographed movement in the Terezín production of Brundibar and also coordinated movement for other major children's theatrical activities, including Borovci, or Fireflies. She survived the war and migrated to England afterwards, but no direct testimonial records exist of her time in the ghetto. However, in 1990, fragments of a Terezín film without sound emerged in a Warsaw ghetto. This film, labelled Terezín 1942, was probably the first iteration of a propaganda project about the ghetto. The project may have been cancelled early on because of some of the subversive content contained within the clips. Here is a 20-second clip from that film of Camilla Rosenbaum dancing with a suitcase. With the possibility of deportation to unknown destinations in the East looming over every Terezín resident, Rosenbaum's movement is itself commentary about packing and unpacking and the precarious existence for the Jews of Terezín. I showed this clip to our director, Shana. She organised very specific choreographed movement during the dream interlude between acts involving the animals and enlisted the help of Rob McCready, a professional choreographer, to map the scene. Of all the lessons learned along the way, and believe me, when you've never put on an opera before, let alone a children's opera, you learn very fast. Probably the most impressive one was the way in which the children began to cooperate and act as a unit. This idea of communal cooperation, intrinsic to the message of Brundibar, is something not really promoted in today's culture of individuality. But there was a tangible sense of this throughout, which grew and grew as the children and crew became closer entwined. My only regret in staging of this work, and my recommendation to future producers of Brundibar, is to rotate the cast and allow understudies to swap with principals, giving more of a sense of ownership to each performer. The talk of cooperation brings me to the last section of my examination here, talking about the way in which historical context is integrated in the work. With permission from Boozy and Hawkes in Germany, we obtained rights to perform the 2003 English adaptation made by Tony Kushner for the Chicago Opera. Kushner, most famous for his epic Angels in America, worked with Maurice Sendak, author of Where the Wild Things Are. Sendak designed the costumes and the sets for this very successful production, and in 2004 the duo published a best-selling children's book based on the opera. Early on in our production, the director Shana Galvin made emphasis of the simple message of the work. Without knowing it, she was articulating the very same message that many of my survivors had communicated to me about Brundibar, that it was an allegory, a simple one, about cooperation and defeating bullies.
The story of Brundibar, it's if we stand strong together, we can win against one bully. But if we're frightened, that one person will overcome all of us. We have to show what Brundibar's like, and that's why we rehearse, so we can find that and then figure out how we're going to tell the audience.
Good, okay, let's go a bit more complicated one. It's a fight against a bully. It's an easy read. The Czechs against the Germans, the Jews against Hitler, etc., etc. And it can be reinterpreted in any fashion, really, if one wants to. But the beauty of an implicit allegorical message. Tom, do you think you can be offensive as Brundibar?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
I'm the loudest one by far.
He does the old one. Brundibar. The sensibility of cooperation and resistance against bullies shaped the trajectory of the direction, so that no overt references to Terezín or the Holocaust entered the performance of the opera itself, much to my relief. There were no striped pyjamas on display, incidentally completely unknown in Terezín. People wore their own clothes in the ghetto. The costumes designed by our incredibly talented and generous seamstress Anitra Gollings reflected the children's wear of the 1930s. Shana continued the allegorical theme with the choice of animal costumes. Brundibar's military coat was informed by Jerry Rin's testimony. Organ grinders in Czech towns and villages were often licensed to certain areas and were also more often than not veterans of a previous conflict, unable to work physical jobs. Anitra took this into account when designing the jacket. Many productions, including the Adelaide 2003 season, include explicit references linking Brundibar to the post-Terezín fate of deportation to Auschwitz. The most extreme example of this that I found was a 1999 premiere of Brundibar for Berlin, where the primary street scene depicted was one where the children, clad in grey underwear, sifted through mountains of clothing for costumes. The director had intended a large Goebbels-style radio to replace Brundibar's organ, and also wanted more than 4,000 square feet of netting over the audience. This was not realised in that final production, which had to be cut back drastically because of extravagant plans and funding shortfalls. Interpretations have softened in recent times, but directors still feel the need for historical reference and sometimes allusions to current events. Sometimes directors avoid the obligation of historical contextuality by inviting survivors to come and talk to the audience and cast afterwards. In the Kushner adaptation, the American playwright extends the Brechtian agitprop flavour of the original plot, adding several lines delivered by the villainous Brundibar and also adding other historical material before the final reprise. Here is a recent example of this from a very excellent 2011 Cape Town production.
They believe that they've won the fight. They believe I'm God. Not quite. Nothing ever works out neatly. Bullies don't give up completely. One departs, the next appears, and we shall meet again, my dears. Though I go, I won't be far. I will be back, la Brundibar.
Chaim Aslander, 8 years old. Joseph Edelstein, Mogilев, 5 years old.
Abraham Goldrosen, Balzac, 1 year old.
And so it goes on. Kushner's addition to the original text depicts the character of Brundibar as beyond time, beyond redemption, ever ready to re-emerge from the shadows. The alteration actively works to resist any ideas of a redemptive reading, but at what cost? Imposing this new ending on the work alters the trajectory of the drama profoundly. Sensitive to the fact that every survivor I interviewed and every account I read of the Terezín performances of the opera testified that Honza Treichlinger, the young actor who played Brundibar in Terezín, joined with the children in the final victory song, I excluded Kushner's modification and requested the director to reinstate the archival reconciliatory moment as seen in this excerpt from our production. They are sensitive, intelligent and engaged kids who want to do a sort of performance that has meaning.
You'll find that trouble ends when you rely on friends. That's the whole point of it.
Brundibar is a charming work, but does not exist in a cultural and social vacuum. One cannot claim that it is a masterpiece worthy of exploration detached from the place in which it received its greatest fame or infamy, depending on your perspective. How then did the Sydney Brundibar project deal with historical contextualisation without resorting to heavy-handed visual signifiers? I produced an extensive historical note on the web page and a very detailed history of Terezín survivors living in Australia in the concert program. And as part of the evening drama, I relied again on testimony, this time the written testimony of Rudi Freudenfeld, the man who smuggled the score into the ghetto, who conducted the work for all 55 performances. Freudenfeld survived the war, returning to Prague, and took up work as a school teacher. In 1965, in one of the brief communist thaws, he published a memoir entitled Terezínská škola, Terezín School. With the permission of Freudenfeld's daughter and the help of Edith Sheldon, the director and I adapted excerpts and put together an opening monologue delivered by Paul Smith, the Brundibar in the young adult cast. Here's a brief excerpt from that monologue.
That's how I can tell. If I think I recognize someone in a crowd, on the street or at a station, I whistle a little piece of Brundibar, and if they pick up the tune, then I know I'm right. They were there. It all seems like such a sad fairy story now. The story of how I became a famous conductor. It's a tale complete with orphans, poor townsfolk, ogres, dark, dark days, and few moments that were bright and golden.
In what way did our production resist the redemptive reading? Successful works of art, whether they are stored in archives, hidden in private collections, or revived for the purpose of commemoration, are points where discourses on history, narrative, power, and meaning intersect. Popular interest is growing in neglected material, perhaps fostered by the increasing accessibility of digital and community archives. My co-investigator on the Performing the Jewish Archive project, Dr. Helen Finch, and I have sensed a disconnect between the eagerness of researchers to retrieve coherent, redemptive narratives about the past and the important, troubling questions about the nature of power, authority and destruction raised decades ago by Derrida and Foucault. As Chris Ingraham says, quote, "The implication that documents kept in an archival record a coherent, disinterested story about their subject, moreover neglects the shifting, dynamic multiplicity of that subject. The positivist association of the archive with evidence necessary for rational deduction about the past conflicts with more rhetorical notions that the archive is unstable, constructed, and hence resistant of static interpretation. Although our production was heavily influenced by all kinds of survivor testimony, it is important to note that such testimony rarely strayed into the redemptive realm. Survivors talked matter of fact with the children and young adults about experiences, never speaking in general terms about resistance. Mitigated by a scholarly concern to see voices of the survivors emerge and shape our production, allowed for individual participation without the need to build a falsely coherent narrative from musical memories. The cast and crew of Brundibar engaged with the work in three ways, but performatively, dialogically, and ethically. At times we acknowledged the holes and gaps in the work, engendered listening, allowing individual subjectivity to emerge through every actor and every participant.
I'm really happy that I got into Brundibar.
Why was it popular? Well, it was performed by children.
I am passionate about acting, I'm passionate about singing, though I'm not so good at singing.
And it was performed to entertain other children.
They have evil eyes, snotty noses, wicked. That's my diagnosis.
The children who performed it were allowed to take off their Judenstern, their yellow star, and perform as if they were in a normal context.
Little children, wake up too. We've a villain to pursue. Wake up, children, wake up, lazy cat.
Well, I love singing and acting and just putting it together. It's just lots of fun.
They had a sense of joy on their faces, and that was an alluring and appealing and assuaging experience for audience members.
Organ grinder Brundibar.
Way back in the 1990s, Arjun Appadurai noted that the past has ceased to be, quote, a land to return to in a simple politics of memory. If, as Appadurai says, the past is a synchronic warehouse of cultural scenarios, then such works as Brundibar can turn on a point, either as a presentation of a particular historical reading of that past, or as a refutation of a particular historical reading of that past. One thing is for certain, the examination of this and other works in the Jewish archive holds within a potential for aesthetic complexity, which will assist in the resistance against any authoritative reading of such histories. We have a great deal of Czech and German and Austrian survivors who would have seen it in the camp, and so it's a great thing for them to revisit it.
you forgot where you are, what you are, and what's going to be. I have to say it gave, including me, the people hope that it might go better.
It's going to be great to see Jerry at both performances. Suppose we have the cat here and the bird. There was no question that he was going to be at both performances and the dress rehearsal, and probably the technical rehearsal too. He's going to really enjoy it. In returning to Brundibar, the dialogical engagement with survivor witnesses and the wish to honour those memories governed by the choices we made collectively throughout the production, rather than to an obligation to codify the presentation as being more true to the original performance. Discussions with performers and the creative team contributed to all decisions. We created an immensely strong sense of communal spirit in the cast, enough to quell anxieties about imposed meanings and reassure that an open-ended interpretation was being offered to all: the performances, the performers, the audiences, and even the voices of the long-dead authors. Thank you.